Hello and welcome to this India Today special. As India celebrates 70 years of independence, we're taking you on a very special journey. A journey through the triumphs and the tragedies, the dreams and the disappointments over the last 70 years, the defining moments of India's remarkable journey. And to take us through that is the preeminent chronicler of modern independent India, Ramachandra Guha. Appreciate you're joining us, Dr. Guha. Your new book, India After Gandhi, is out in a new edition. Thank you for taking us through this journey. Let's start, Ram, with the first decade, 47 to 57. And the first 5 years in particular, that was a very exciting but turbulent period.
Absolutely, Rajdeep. And it's hard to think of a new nation that was born amidst such difficult, indeed tragic circumstances. Partition, brutal Hindu-Muslim riots, refugees fleeing from one side of the border to another, the state of the princely states undecided, famine stalking the land, and no new nation, as I said, was born in such difficult circumstances. And possibly few new nations have had such a visionary and capable cohort of leaders to unite a diverse and divided population and give it a democratic constitution. And of course, it starts with Jawaharlal Nehru and his moving, eloquent, still much anthologized speech at the midnight hour.
Did he write it himself?
Of course. And he may have said it spontaneously. But not just Nehru. I think it's important to recognize the other great figures around him. Patel was his equal in every respect. They had disagreements, but then Gandhiji died, and they submerged those disagreements and came together to unite the country, to lead the government. There was Rajagopalachari in Bengal, governor of Bengal at a time of very horrible communal violence. He provided sagacious leadership. There were social workers, Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay, Mridula Sarabhai, Begum Anis Kidwai, who resettled the refugees, who rescued abandoned women. There were outstanding civil servants who manned the administration of the state. There were great leaders in other parts of the country. I mean, Gopinath Bordoloy in Assam. I mean, Kamraj in Tamil Nadu, B.C. Roy in Bengal. So it was a generation of selfless, capable institution builders. I mean, Nehru and Patel may have been at the top. I mean, they were two towering figures. But they were Ambedkar. I mean, one of the most extraordinary features of those first months is that Ambedkar, who had been a lifelong rival and opponent of the Congress party, who was in the Viceroy's Executive Council when these people were in jail because of the Quit India movement, in a great act of reconciliation, he joined the cabinet because Nehru and Patel and Gandhi knew that despite their past political disagreements, Ambedkar was a colossal legal brain, and they needed him on board to help draft the constitution. So it's that, it's a combination of Kamet the men and the women, not just one man, but a cohort of remarkable politicians, statesmen, administrators, social workers who healed the wounds of partition and brought together unity.
Healed the wounds of partition and also the assassination of the Mahatma on the 30th of January 1948. That event, in a sense, could have really unraveled the entire freedom movement.
Absolutely.
Instead, it seemed to strengthen the resolve of many of these leaders.
Absolutely. And Gandhiji had anticipated this. He said in 1909 when he was in South Africa, if I am killed, it may bring Hindus and Muslims together. I mean, it was a prophetic statement made almost 40 years before the act. Once he was murdered, and Nehru had the presence of mind to say immediately on radio, it was a Hindu extremist who killed him. And Hindus recoiled at horror at what they'd done, act of patricide, killing your own father, the father of the nation. And there was reconciliation, there was forgiveness, and above all, Nehru and Patel, the two main figures in government, decided whatever their intellectual or personal disagreements, they had to be set aside, and in the memory of their common master, because they were both devoted to Gandhi, they had both been nurtured by Gandhi for 20, 30 years previously, they must come together and work. Patel's role in unification, to get 500 princely states on board was an extraordinarily difficult task. I mean, no previous nation had ever had to tackle a problem of this kind, one by one, to get these princes to accede, to get them to merge their territory with the Union. I mean, Hyderabad wanted to stay independent. If Hyderabad wanted to stay independent, a cancer through the heart of India, as Patel called it, and had stayed independent, I could not have come from Bangalore today to have this conversation with you. So the unification of India was Patel's great contribution, but it was not his only contribution. He also professionalized the civil service. The IAS replaced the ICS and transformed itself from an organization of rule to an organization of development and governance. It was Patel who got Ambedkar into the Constituent Assembly, and it was Patel who negotiated with the other Congress members to collaborate with the professional constitutional lawyers who were drafting the Constitution.
The drafting of the Constitution, you say importantly, was in a way an act of reconciliation, bringing together different figures representing various ideologies on one platform. So in a sense, is it Ambedkar's document, or is it the document of the collective wisdom of the people of the time?
Well, it's a document not of collective wisdom, it's a document of several people. There were 240 odd members of the Constituent Assembly. The debates are online. I urge all young Indians to read them. They're really rich debates. I mean, people could argue without abuse or personalizing issues at that time. So it was not one person's document. It was not a single author document, but nor was it the collective will of 300 million Indians. It was probably a dozen people who played very important roles. And in those dozen, Ambedkar, Rajendra Prasad, Patel, K.M. Munshi, Alladi Krishnamurti Iyer, and a great civil servant called B.N. Rao, whom Ambedkar thanks in his last speech. He was an unacknowledged hero of the Indian Constitution because he was a meticulous draftsman and he drafted many of the clauses.
2 years after the drafting of the Constitution, India decides to have its first general election on the principle of one person, one vote. And many critics called it the greatest gamble in history. The gamble worked. How did it work?
Absolutely. And it was a gamble. It was an act of faith, principally on the part of Jawaharlal Nehru. From the late 1920s, had been convinced that when India became free, we must have universal adult franchise. We talk about the 20s when women did not have the vote in many Western countries. But Nehru particularly, the Congress party as a whole, Gandhi also, but Nehru particularly was absolutely committed to universal adult franchise. And in many ways, that is his greatest achievement. Against strong opposition. The RSS general, the organizer, said Pandit Nehru will live to regret the day when he decided on universal adult franchise. Now they are in power because of Pandit Nehru's universal adult franchise. The communists opposed it. The liberals opposed it. Intellectuals said you can't trust poor people with the vote. But I think it was an act of faith. It was a gamble, but it worked because it brought together India in a way, and it still brings together India in a way in which no other thing does. I mean, on election day, all of India is one. All of India is going to vote.
We then come to 1956, Ram, and the reorganization of states along linguistic lines. Patel unifies the states in 1947
Between 47 and 50.
56, and then in 56 you have the reorganization of states along linguistic lines. And even today it is debated, was that a good step or was that potentially divisive?
Well, I don't think there is any debate now. At the time, you're right, there was a debate. There was a great worry that India had been divided on religious lines, India and Pakistan, and the demand for linguistic states would lead to a further balkanization. And Nehru and Patel were both worried. But Gandhi had promised the people of the South and the West that they would have linguistic states once India became independent. And you must remember, Rajdeep, that India is a land of many languages and many great literary languages. The history of Tamil is older than the history of Sanskrit. You know, Kannada, Odia, Malayalam, Telugu are all great classical languages with literary histories of 1,000, 1,500 years. And language is the fundamental element of human being. You speak a language. It comes before your faith. The child speaks words before she knows which religion she is or which caste she is. And in recognition of this sentiment, Gandhi had promised linguistic states. Nehru and Patel were ambivalent. Then in 52, Pottichiramalu went on fast, forced their hand, and it was really a major popular movement among the Kannadigas, among the Tamils, among your fellow Maharashtrians, among the Gujaratis, among the Odias. And finally, Nehru conceded the principle. He formed the States Reorganization Commission, which mandated the creation of linguistic states. Today, there is no debate. India is united because of linguistic states. Pakistan was divided because Jinnah imposed Urdu on the Bengalis of East Pakistan. Sri Lanka experienced decades of unending and savage civil war because the Sinhala majority imposed their language on the Tamils of the north. And the Tamils of the north were as proud of their language as the Tamils of our Tamils. but they weren't given the freedom to have a state in their own language, to educate themselves in their own language, to compete on equal terms with the Sinhala speakers. So I think though at the time there was a debate, today there is no debate. In my view, the two greatest achievements of independent India are first, regular, free and fair elections, and second, linguistic pluralism. You do not have to unite citizens around one language. You can unite them around a shared set of values. Democracy, equality of all castes, of genders, of economic growth. You can unite them on values, but you don't need to unite them on a single language.
Ram, let's now turn to the second decade, 1957 to 67. Somewhere in this decade, the hopes and the dreams of the midnight speech of Nehru seemed to dissipate, particularly once the Sino-Indian War broke out. Jawaharlal Nehru, the towering figure of this generation, suddenly seemed to be weakened and undermined. Would you agree that this was the decade where disillusionment began to set in with the Sino-Indian War?
That's right. And even before the Sino-Indian War, Rajdeep, the first corruption scandal was the Mundra scandal of 1959, which is in this second decade. The first misuse of Article 356 was Nehru's government's dismissal of the left front Kerala government in 1959. So there had been various kinds of disillusionment. Nehru himself, who had been a great figure, who had contributed enormously to nurturing a democratic ethos in India, became immune to criticism. He was an early victim of what is now an endemic Indian disease of remarkable people who don't know when to retire. Later people who caught this disease include Ratan Tata, Varghese Kurian, the great Sachin Tendulkar. He stayed out too long. So Nehru was advised in 1958 to retire and nurture a successor. But he seemed to think he was indispensable. And also he wasn't listening to the best advice. When it came to defense, he had a man who was intellectually brilliant, but as a manager and administrator disastrous, who was Krishna Menon, and who never took the Chinese threat seriously, who undermined the morale of the army, who fought with General Thimayya, who was one of the greatest and most capable generals in the history of the Indian army. And this led finally to the China War. We were desperately underprepared and we were humiliated on the battlefield. So, and what happens, of course, there was also the failure of the monsoons, an agrarian crisis. So this was a time when some of the great hopes were turning sour across India. But it's a very complex relationship between India and China. These are two great civilizations. Two civilizations that had recently been colonized by European powers, that after a long struggle for independence had achieved freedom. The Chinese had to struggle even harder than us because they struggled not only against European imperialism but against Japanese imperialism. They were newly independent, finding their place in the world and rubbing against each other at the borders. So some kind of conflict was inevitable as two ancient civilizations finding themselves in the modern world, overcoming colonialism, came into contact.
It was a decade where my home state, Goa, was liberated, almost the last corner of India by the Portuguese in December of 1961. I see that as a defining moment.
I would like to make a remark on that. That's very important. And it's a tribute to Indian democracy. The great scholar Benedict Anderson points out that India liberated Goa from Portuguese rule and immediately held an election and has held elections every 5 years since. Indonesia liberated East Timor from Portuguese rule and for 40 years never allowed an election in East Timor till East Timor finally got independence from Indonesia. So I think that liberation of Goa and the honorable integration of Goa and its conversion from a colony of a most brutal European empire to a self-governing state of India is also a great tribute to the democratic vision of our founders.
Jawaharlal Nehru passes away in 1964 and we then have Lal Bahadur Shastri becoming Prime Minister. And there are many who will say Shastri didn't get his due, particularly because it was the period where the agrarian crisis that you alluded to pushed Shastri into pushing ahead with the Green Revolution idea and the concept of Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan.
That's right.
Do you believe that Lal Bahadur Shastri deserves greater credit perhaps?
He was a very capable, focused Prime Minister, understated, totally committed to the pluralistic values of the Congress party and of Nehru and Gandhi. He was a great war leader in the 65 war, and in that war, he made a famous speech at the Ramlila Maidan in Delhi. On his left was Mir Mushtaq Ahmed, who was president of the Delhi Pradesh Congress. On his right was Frank Anthony, an Anglo-Indian member of parliament. And he said in that speech, "This is what makes us different from Pakistan. Mir Mushtaq ji is on my left and Frank Anthony is on our right. We are not a Hindu country. They may be a Muslim country." So he was a capable prime minister, a great war leader, and he could delegate. Just as Patel was the greatest home minister in the history of independent India, the greatest agriculture minister was C. Subramaniam, whom Shastri trusted with the agriculture ministry, and Shastri, Subramaniam, and scientists such as M.S. Swaminathan, who is happily still alive, laid the foundations of the Green Revolution in 64, 65, 66. Shastri tragically died in 1966. So the fruits of the Green Revolution were only visible in the late 60s and early 70s, and Indira Gandhi mistakenly is given the credit for this. But it was really Shastri and Subramaniam who saved India's economic independence.
We now come to the decade of 1967 to 1977, which many will see as the decade of Indira Gandhi. She was the towering figure politically who dominated the politics of that decade. And really her moment of dominance was reflected in 1971 when India liberated Bangladesh. Would it be her finest moment without a shadow of doubt?
Absolutely. But before I come to the Bangladesh war, let's briefly talk about the beginning of the decade. 1967, the Congress loses hegemony, does not lose power in Delhi, but loses countrywide hegemony for the first time. The DMK wins in Tamil Nadu. The communists win in Kerala. Through the northern belt, there are a coalition of caste and socialist parties that defeat the Congress. So it starts with Indira Gandhi vulnerable, 67.
The Gungi Gudia, as she was called.
And then she slowly asserts control, gives herself a leftist pro-poor image, which is more tactical than deeply felt from inside, nationalizes the banks, eliminates the princely order, and then of course comes the Bangladesh crisis, where we give refuge to 10 million displaced people from Bangladesh, a poor country from East Pakistan. We come out firmly against Pakistani military atrocities in East Pakistan, and of course we win the war. And then she's a great national figure, but rightly so, because I think it was a just war. If there was a war that was just, it was a war to liberate the Bangladeshis from decades of humiliation, persecution and occupation by the West Pakistanis. So she did provide capable, strong and decisive leadership, just as Shastri did in 65 and just as Nehru did not do in 62. So in that sense, Indira Gandhi should not be denied. She should not get sole credit, but she should certainly get substantial credit.
Should she also take then the calumny of what happened in 1975 when she chose to suspend the constitution and declare an emergency in the country? Should she be held guilty as charged?
Absolutely, absolutely. She overreacted. There was a popular movement led by Jaya Prakash Narayan that was, countrywide. There was some, JP was a great man whom I venerate, but he did say some foolish things during that the movement, including that the police and the army should disobey the orders of the government. Right. But having said that, Indira Gandhi clearly overreacted. The Supreme Court would have overruled the Allahabad High Court judgment. All they wanted was for her to step aside for a few weeks, which she was not prepared to do. And instead of which she not only promulgated the emergency, but suspended civil liberties, suppressed the press, and arrested all the opposition leaders and humiliated them. Particularly those she did not like. She sent to the worst jails. I mean, two Maharanis, for example, who were sent to the most dirty and rat-infested jails.
Gayatri Devi and
Vijayaraja Scindia. Right? So she was vindictive and vicious. That really showed her dark side. At the same time, 19 months later, she withdrew the emergency. And that was the only decision of those 19 months in which she did not consult her rowdy son Sanjay.
I was about to mention Sanjay Gandhi because in that particular period, Sanjay Gandhi acquired a larger than life image and he became almost the villain eventually of the times. Do you believe that Indira Gandhi by then was being virtually dictated by her son and the son had virtually taken over government?
No, she was running it with his help. He was the number two. He was the extra constitutional authority, as it were. But Sanjay was certainly more important than all the other cabinet ministers. But as Prime Minister, she bears ultimate responsibility. She indulged her son. Her son was responsible for the worst excesses of the emergency, especially forced sterilization and also the destruction of houses in many parts of Delhi and northern India, harassment of Muslims. And in fact, one of the first examples of targeting attacks on minorities was by Sanjay Gandhi. But Indira Gandhi must bear the main share of the blame for the emergency.
Ram, many would say the period from 1977 to 87 was one which saw triumph and tragedy both coexist very uneasily. Perhaps the most difficult decade, some would say, that India had to face. But it started with a great deal of hope, because 1977 saw the lifting of the emergency and the emergence of the first non-Congress government based, it was said, on people power.
Absolutely, Rajdeep. It was inconceivable to someone like me, who was 19 in, say, 1977, that the Congress would ever not rule in New Delhi. It was also inconceivable to someone like me that Bombay would not win the Ranji Trophy. In 1975, Bombay lost the Ranji Trophy, and that meant that the Congress also had to lose the general election shortly afterwards. So it started with great hope, but the Janata Party soon disintegrated in squalid factional squabbles. Indira Gandhi came back. Indira Gandhi in her second term was insecure, paranoid, was suspicious, even more suspicious than being in her first term. There was the uprising in the Punjab. It was very badly handled. Operation Blue Star was a shameful act for the Indian army to invade a sacred place of worship and kill people there. And then, of course, that was followed by her assassination. This was also the decade of the Bhopal gas tragedy. So it's a decade, I remember, I was there in my 20s, as a very troubled and difficult decade.
I'll come to some of the more troubling parts in a moment, but I thought we started the decade with this new Prime Minister Morarji Desai.
Yeah.
Interesting figure, a Gandhian,
Yeah.
but a very austere individual in many ways. So someone who represented in a way a break with the past.
But he's an underrated person. His personal eccentricities have overshadowed the fact that he was an outstanding administrator and he was a thoroughgoing Democrat. He said democracy has been vasectomized by the emergency. And as Prime Minister, working with Shanti Bhushan, who was his law minister, a great legal luminary, thankfully still with us, Shanti Bhushan and Morarji Desai undid all the emergency era amendments and restored the basic structure of our constitution. It was also Morarji Desai who got experts into government for the first time. The first scientist who was agriculture secretary was M.S. Swaminathan, appointed by Morarji Desai. The first economist who was finance secretary was Dr. Manmohan Singh, appointed by Morarji Desai. So he was an underrated figure, he was an outstanding administrator, but he was not a good leader of men. So his party disintegrated into faction fighting.
So the Janata experiment virtually amoeba-like broke up within the space of 3 years.
2.5 years. 2.5 years.
Was it a lack of leadership, or was it that India was not ready as yet for a non-Congress government?
I think both. I think lack of leadership. I think rivalries between Morarji, Charan Singh and Jagjeevan Ram. The whole dual membership question, where people joined the Janata Party but remained members of the RSS. But still, it gave the Indian citizenry and it gave the Indian public a sense that this will not be a one-party state. In Mexico, one party ruled for 70 years. In many African countries, one party ruled forever, right? So I think it's an important milestone in Indian democracy because it challenged the notion that only one party has the sovereign right to rule in New Delhi.
And the man, in a sense, who had brought it together was Jaya Prakash Narayan, who was eventually devoured by this revolution that he had created.
But he was a remarkable figure. And again, not always remembered for the right reasons. Of course, his opposition to the emergency was a great milestone in his career. But he was one of the people who promoted decentralization, Panchayati Raj, before anyone else from the 1950s. He bravely struggled for reconciliation in Nagaland with the rebels there. He brought the dacoits on board, got them to give up their arms. And he was a great unacknowledged hero of independent India. And again, he should not be reduced to his opposition to the emergency. He was a multifaceted figure. He was an original political thinker. He had a great capacity to build teams of young people who would carry forward his work. He was a remarkable man.
1984 is a year that some describe as Annus horribilis. It was a year where things just seemed to go from bad to worse. You had Operation Blue Star, the assassination of Indira Gandhi, Bhopal gas tragedy. You alluded to some of them, but Operation Blue Star, the storming of the Golden Temple and Indira's assassination led to the emergence of a Khalistani movement and the idea of a separate Sikh state. Do you believe that was one moment where again the fragility possibly of the Indian state was exposed?
Very much so. And again, Indira Gandhi is responsible because she and Sanjay promoted Bhindranwale to undercut the Akalis. And then Bhindranwale became a major figure in his own right, a charismatic preacher preaching violence against Hindus. And freedom of Khalistan. She could have acted in 1982-83 and flushed the temple free of the 60 or 80 militants who were there, but she waited 2 years, by which time an army action was the only option left. And then, of course, this was followed by her tragic murder, which was followed in turn by the horrific pogrom against Sikhs, in which the Congress party was directly culpable and responsible. And then, of course, in December, you had the Bhopal gas tragedy. So, of the 70 years of independence, 1984 was absolutely our worst year.
Ram, as you said, 1984 was perhaps the worst year that India had in the 70 years since independence. Ironically, just a year before that was for me possibly one of my best years, because as an 18-year-old, I saw India win the World Cup, defeating the mighty West Indies. I just wonder whether that period of winning the World Cup, color television coming into India for the first time, is to be seen as a momentous, as a defining moment.
No, I think absolutely, because mass popular culture, in which film and cricket plays such a crucial role, was enabled and furthered by satellite television, which comes in the 1980s. If we had won the World Cup in 1975, it would not have the same impact. We also won the World Cup, I think, as cricket lovers, we can agree, and you watched the match. Partly we were lucky. If Gordon Greenidge had not left the ball from Balwinder Sandhu and been bowled, I think West Indies might have won by 10 wickets. So, but it was a stroke of good fortune for cricket lovers, for sponsors, for those who sold televisions.
Ram, let's come to the next decade, 1987 to 1997. And in many ways, it was a defining period, because you had three major influences that emerged to collide almost with each other: the Mandal movement, the Mandir movement, and the growth towards the market. We'll come to all these individually, but I want to start with the figure who was ruling India at the time, Rajiv Gandhi. Do you believe that history has been a little unkind to Rajiv Gandhi, or do you believe Rajiv Gandhi's period was responsible to a large extent to many of the troubles that would follow, particularly the growing communal conflict?
I don't think history has been unkind to Rajiv Gandhi. He had a great deal of goodwill. He had 400 MPs. He was seen as young, untainted by politics. The country was behind him, and he blew it all away. He blew it away first by the Shah Banu case, by not supporting progressive Muslims who wanted equality for Muslim women. Then he blew it away by opening the lacks to the Ayodhya temple, and that led to endemic Hindu-Muslim conflict. There was the Bofors corruption scandal. So I don't think history has been unkind to Rajiv Gandhi. Perhaps if Rajiv Gandhi had not been so tragically assassinated, if he'd had a second term, he'd been a wiser, a more thoughtful, a more inclusive Prime Minister. We don't know. But I believe that he bears primary responsibility for polarizing Hindus and Muslims. Through what he did in the Shah Banu case and what he did in Ayodhya, he set in motion a series of events that torment us till today. He also rigged the 87 Kashmir election. It was his government that rigged the 87 Kashmir election. So I think Rajiv Gandhi and his administration and his advisors are fundamentally responsible for the religious and social cleavages that we still have to contend with today.
And those cleavages came to the fore on one terrible day, December 6, 1992. We are entering almost the 25th anniversary of the demolition of the Babri Masjid, the rise of the BJP and the Hindutva mood that was created with the chariot of L.K. Advani and the Ram Janmabhoomi movement. Should they therefore be seen as culpable in having, because that movement led to widespread rioting. The demolition was followed by widespread rioting.
Absolutely. And I think it starts with 86, 87. I should also say one more item to add to the list of Rajiv Gandhi's mistakes. His banning of satanic verses even before Ayatollah Khomeini had done in Iran. So he pandered to Hindu fundamentalists and to Muslim fundamentalists. And he strengthened the forces of reaction and bigotry on both sides of the divide, which led, of course, to 1992, to the demolition of the Babri Masjid, to the rise of Hindutva, to the wave of riots across northern and western India, in which Muslims were the main sufferers, to the vengeful reaction to that in terms of the Mumbai attack led by the terrorists, Tiger Memon and others. So it was, and we are still living with that. I mean, the kind of fragile unity that India has today and has had since the 1980s. The first 2 decades were virtually of independence, were virtually free of Hindu-Muslim conflict. Everyone felt Indian. And now, identity politics, polarization, insecurity, all this is visible.
How do you see the Ram Janmabhoomi movement? Is it to be seen as the BJP would like us to see as a mass movement, or should it be seen as the first attempt in a way to move away from the constitution of Ambedkar that guaranteed equal rights and virtually in a way create an extra constitution?
Absolutely. I mean, firstly, it was a mass movement, but a mass movement for perverted ends, for polarizing society, for undermining public institutions. I think in many ways it damaged not just our secular fabric, but our democratic institutions, and that is what is worrying. It gave legitimacy to street protest, violent street protest, not non-violent. Gandhiji always practiced non-violence, right? So, and even the linguistic state movements was largely non-violent. But this was attacking your enemies, burning down properties, demolishing shrines. So this is the kind of vandalism and gundagiri that started with the Babri Masjid.
Many will say that that movement itself was provoked by another movement which was emerging, which was the Mandal movement. The movement to provide reservations to the other backward castes, with VP Singh, who had replaced Rajiv Gandhi as Prime Minister, championing that particular move. Do you believe Mandal in a way has almost outlasted the Mandir juggernaut?
No, I think the Mandir movement originated independent of the Mandal movement. And its momentum came from independent forces and motivations. Mandal was a very complicated phenomenon. Clearly, Dalits and Adivasis had been discriminated against grievously in Indian society, which is why the constitution under Ambedkar mandated affirmative action for them. OBCs wanted parity with Dalits and Adivasis. That is a complex legal and sociological question which we can debate for hours and never arrive at a conclusion. But the Mandal movement was an assertion of the fact that at the ballot box, the backward classes had captured power. Across northern India and southern India, it was the classes in between the Dalits and the Brahmins and the Baniyas, the Suvarnas, who were in political power, and they wanted a share of administrative power to complement their political power. So the affirmative action for Dalits and Adivasis is clearly a question of social justice. Affirmative action for OBCs is a question of giving administrative power to those people who already enjoy political power. It's a different issue. I don't think it has the same moral sanctity. I think VP Singh was mistaken to extend affirmative action to the OBCs, and I think it's distorted our institutions.
And while Mandal and Mandir were emerging as the dominant forces of Indian politics, P.V. Narasimha Rao becomes the Prime Minister after the assassination of Rajiv Gandhi, and in June-July of 1991, we have a budget in which India's first attempt to move away from the socialism of the past results in the first tentative moves towards a market economy and economic liberalization.
Yeah, I think P.V. Narasimha Rao was a fascinating figure. A little bit like Shastri, underrated because he did not belong to the Nehru-Gandhi family. And so the Congress never, even though he was a lifelong congressman, the Congress deliberately downplayed his achievements. But I think he and Manmohan Singh, as his very effective and important finance minister, laid the foundations of a surge in economic growth. The long overdue reforms of the economy took place under them. Narasimha Rao also reoriented our foreign policy towards his Look East strategy. He reduced our dependence on the Soviet or the socialist bloc. He was a very unusual man. He was a thinker, a scholar, but of course committed mistakes. especially allowing the destruction of the Babri Masjid was one such. But I think he and Manmohan Singh, between them, the way they dismantled the license permit Raj through stealth, they pretended to be socialists and actually became capitalists, I think is quite remarkable. India had to shed its autarkic, isolationist economic policy and integrate with the world.
Ram, let's now turn to the decade from 1997 to 2007. As India enters the millennium, it enters with hopes but also with a few anxieties. The anxieties first. You have at the turn of the century in 2002, the Gujarat riots. Before that, you have terror attacks, including Parliament being targeted. It was a sense again that Indian democracy remained fragile, that communal divisions continued in a way to undermine Indian democracy, as did the threat of violent terror, especially emanating from Pakistan.
After 1989, which is when the Soviets withdraw from Afghanistan, the jihadis who are in Afghanistan turn their attention to India, to Kashmir in particular, but not only to Kashmir. So you have, on the one side, you have Islamic fundamentalism coming in from the West. On the other side, you have a resurgence of Hindu fundamentalism promoted by the Babri Masjid demolition and all of that. And this leads to escalating tensions across northern and western India. And the Gujarat riots, of course, take place.
So the Godhra train burning and the riots that follow, in a sense, reflect the rise of terror as well as the reaction of Hindu fundamentalism.
Not the reaction, the independent rise of terror and the independent rise of Hindu fundamentalism. Let's not see one as a reaction to the other. There is a rise of Islamic terrorism, and particularly from the West, and in the heartland, UP, Bihar, Gujarat, Maharashtra, there's the independent rise of Hindu fundamentalism in a sense that India must be a Hindu nation. I mean, the whole RSS idea of Hindu Rashtra is not a reaction to Islamic fundamentalism. The two processes are occurring simultaneously and wreaking havoc, not just when they collide, but also independently.
The Prime Minister at the time was Atal Bihari Vajpayee, who in a sense was, some say, cut in the Nehruvian cloth, was often called the saffron Nehruite, was the first non-Congress Prime Minister to complete a full term, and yet perhaps also has not been given his due. The nuclear tests at Pokhran 2 took place during his tenure. The Kargil war was won at the time, and he seemed to be someone pushing ahead with economic liberalization as well.
And also, I think one of the underappreciated achievements of Vajpayee was the focus on infrastructure and particularly roads. You know, I think to build a unified market, to enable the free movement of commodities, of transportation, of people.
The Pradhan Mantri Sadak Yojana.
Yeah. So I think Vajpayee was a very interesting man. He was clearly on the liberal end of the saffron spectrum. He was humane. He had a sense of humor. He could take jokes at himself. He was not a megalomaniac. He had friendships, and he was an unusual person.
His ability to reach out to Pakistan, the Lahore bus yatra, unfortunately followed by the Kargil war, he seemed to be someone who had that Nehruvian spirit of reconciling differences.
Very much so. And again, as someone who led a 20-party or 22-party coalition, which is a complex and difficult job. It's much easier being Prime Minister when your own party has a majority. You know, it was easier for Nehru, easier for Indira, and now easier for Narendra Modi. So to successfully run a 20-odd party coalition, I think was a considerable achievement in the context of Indian democracy.
Economic growth, in a sense, represented the hope at the turn of the millennium, the aspirations. You come from Bengaluru, where suddenly we saw a city which was once seen as a pensioner's paradise, now becoming the IT hub of the country. Information technology, less dependent perhaps on government, seemed to symbolize the urges and aspirations of what many call the demographic dividend of a young country. Do you believe that was also a defining moment in this decade as we turn into the 21st century?
The IT boom in my hometown, Bengaluru, but also in Hyderabad and Chennai and other places, you know, it's a product of processes that were set in motion in the 1950s. Without Jawaharlal Nehru and the IITs, you would not have had the IT boom. Because without Jawaharlal Nehru and Rajagopalachari insisting that English must be retained as the language of scientific communication and not be replaced by Hindi, let alone Sanskrit, which is what some extremists wanted. So The foundations are laid in the 50s, where we had a skilled, educated, English-speaking technological workforce that could take, 40 years later, it could take the fullest advantages of India globalizing and of integrating with the world. Success has many fathers, but in this case, rightly so. Clearly, Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh are responsible for the IT boom, but so is Jawaharlal Nehru for recognizing that a country like India must have high quality technical institutes.
2007 to 2017, a decade where India is led by two contrasting figures. Manmohan Singh from 2007 to 14, and then Narendra Modi as the leader of the first majority non-Congress single party government. Can we assess these two figures, Manmohan Singh and Narendra Modi? What did the rise of Modi after a decade of Manmohan Singh mean to the country?
Well, to begin with Manmohan Singh, I think Manmohan Singh made the same mistake that Jawaharlal Nehru did. He did not know when to retire. He should have left office in 2009. He had just had a heart bypass. He was not very well. Clearly, the party president was an overbearing presence over him. He had had a reasonably successful first term. After the Gujarat riots, he provided a healing touch. Economic growth was continuing under his watch. But the vanity and the seduction of power, compelled him to take a second term in which all the corruption crises took place. And of course, which discredited him and left a very dark shadow over his last years in office, which sadly annulled or negated all the contributions he'd made, not only in his first term as Prime Minister, but also as Finance Minister in the 1990s. And then comes Narendra Modi as an outsider from Gujarat, charismatic figure, brilliant orator in Gujarati and in Hindi, but tireless, extraordinarily hardworking, but also polarizing, and virtually captures the BJP nomination from Prime Minister, and then very adroitly and smartly pits the general election not as a parliamentary contest, but as a presidential contest between him and the indifferent, unwilling, arguably lazy, privileged Rahul Gandhi. It was a brilliant tactical move on the part of Modi to say this is not BJP versus Congress, it is Narendra Modi versus Rahul Gandhi.
But as we see in this decade, the rise of Mr. Modi and the BJP and the decline, in a sense, of the Congress, can we say that the Congress is a party today in terminal decline and the BJP is the new Congress?
Very likely. I mean, one should always be cautious about what predictions one makes. But clearly, the Congress is almost certainly in irrevocable decline. Its state units have totally atrophied. Rahul Gandhi is manifestly incompetent, even compared to Sonia Gandhi, who was hardworking and industrious and had a political shrewdness, at least in her prime, maybe no longer. The BJP is in power across much of northern and western India. It has vibrant state units. It has people on the grounds with boots. It has boots on the grounds. It has a powerful ideology, which I personally don't agree with, but many people find compelling. The Congress has no ideology at all. It has no counter-narrative to offer. So the BJP is, to Indian politics today, what the Congress was in the 50s and 60s. It is dominant, but not hegemonic, by which I mean it will face opposition, not only from regional parties, but from civil society, from scholars, from intellectuals, from thinkers who do not subscribe to its brand of majoritarianism.
And there will be those who will say Narendra Modi is the Indira Gandhi of our times.
In some ways, for example, in his sheer dominance not only over his party, his government, his manipulation of the airwaves, the Man Ki Baat. I mean, remember we used to talk about all Indira radio, right? So the use of AIR to project himself, the fact that he can't abide any criticism, which is also true of was also true of Indira Gandhi. The fact that he trusts only one person, Amit Shah, being to him what Sanjay Gandhi was to Indira Gandhi. His desire to, even the RBI's autonomy is now fragile, and of course it is the fact that he lives politics 24/7. He is like Indira Gandhi.
It is also, of course, a decade that has seen the emergence of middle-class activism. We saw the anti-corruption movement spearheaded by an old Gandhian in Anna Hazare, and then Arvind Kejriwal emerged with his Aam Aadmi Party. Also movements that came in the national capital in the wake of a horrific rape and murder that took place. A sense that the Indian middle class was finally expressing itself strongly against corruption, on issues of gender, on issues of environment that they are now expressing, on issues of pollution. Do you believe the middle class is also coming into its own?
But these are small signs, but they're heartening signs. Because I believe, Rajdeep, that democracy is about much more than elections. Civil society activism is as important to democracy as the regular holding of elections, and this civil society activism must be furthered and deepened if India is to progress.
But Ram, as I look at the challenges we face as a country in 2017, looking ahead, one of them at the moment seems to be Kashmir, and the fact that violence emanating from Pakistan, and indeed violence from within, is in a way pushing Kashmir to the brink.
Yeah, I think Kashmir has been a problem from India right since the inception. And there are many forces. There is the malevolent promotion of terrorism by Pakistan. There's the rise of a kind of a Wahhabist Islam within the valley. And there is also Hindu fundamentalism outside. I mean, they all contribute. And there are some television channels, not yours, but certainly some television channels, that promote anger and hostility towards Kashmiris. You know, sometimes I feel there are Indians who only want the territory of Kashmir, not the people. So if they are our people, we have to reach out to them. Which is why in the second week of July, after the horrific attack on the pilgrims in Anantnag, the most statesman-like response came from our Home Minister Rajnath Singh. And I urge viewers to look at his tweets of July 11th, 2017, where he advocates sobriety, restraint. He says only a few Kashmiris are terrorists. They are our people. We have to promote tolerance and inclusivity. So it's like this on Kashmir, Rajdeep. Pakistan will always stoke trouble. We should not be talking to Pakistan. But if we think the Kashmiris are our own people, we should not demonize them either. Every lynching that takes of an innocent Muslim that takes place in peninsular India is played out in Kashmir on social media and gives more ammunition to the jihadis. So Kashmir on the one side, on the western edge of the Himalaya, Nagaland on the eastern edge of the Himalaya. Here too the problem dates to independence. Fizo, who's an incredibly important Naga separatist leader, wanted independence for Nagaland. There's been a ceasefire in Nagaland for the last 20 years, but no adequate resolution of the problem. In Kashmir, there is low-level violence continuing all the time. And these are two of our major problems, without doubt.
You mentioned Nagaland and Kashmir together. In a sense, is integration of the periphery still a challenge, of the Northeast still a challenge?
Yes.
In the 1960s, for example, there was a fear that with the anti-Hindi riots in Tamil Nadu, that would be a challenge. In the 80s, there was the fear with the emergence of a Khalistani state that Punjab would be a problem. Tamil Nadu got sorted out. Today, Hindi is spoken in some parts of Chennai quite comfortably. Khalistan sorted out. But do you believe the Northeast and Kashmir remain the big challenges?
I think Nagaland, sections of Manipur and the Kashmir Valley remain a challenge. And it's not unusual from a large historical perspective. When you create a nation out of so many different parts, you know, America experienced a civil war 90 years after independence in which 1 million people died. I mean, there were civil wars in France, in Spain, in Britain. Fortunately, in Pakistan, in Sri Lanka, we haven't gone that way, but we have to be vigilant. We have to recognize that the Nagas and the Kashmiris are our people. There may be some Nagas and some Kashmiris who take to arms, who are violent, who want to overthrow the Indian state. But if we want Nagaland and Kashmir to be peaceable and honorable parts of India, we must walk the extra mile.
As you say in your book, we are a 50-50 country. The glass could be half full or half empty. As we enter our 8th decade, is the glass half full or half empty?
It's still 50-50, Rajdeep. We have slipped in some areas. I think our public institutions have become more degraded and incompetent. But citizen activism is a sign of greater democracy. So I think we are still 50-50. As I said, we are a work in progress. We are much freer today than we were in 1947, but not as free and not as democratic as the framers of our constitution hoped we would.
as we watch Indian political democracy, of course, there is one more link that I want to draw between the past and the present. Remember, we won a World Cup in 1983. We also won a World Cup in this decade with Mahendra Singh Dhoni. And there is a similarity in a way between Kapil Dev and Mahendra Singh Dhoni, that they both come from small towns. So maybe the re-emergence or the emergence of the Indian small town hero is a sign that we should look to the future with some element of positivity.
Absolutely. There is a deepening of democracy. And our Indian cricket team, which was dominated by your home state and mine, Mumbai and Karnataka.
Mine more than yours, but yes.
Later on you had the Karnataka cricketers. Now, so I think Dhoni, Kapil Dev still comes from Chandigarh, which is a metro. He is relatively upper class. I think Dhoni is genuinely self-made. But I think it's important that institutions are also nurtured. That it's not that this cult of the personality, Ambedkar warned against it in his speech to the Constituent Assembly, that bhakti in politics is a road to dictatorship. This cult of the personality must not be allowed to corrode our institutions which undergird our democracy.
And I think that's a warning both to our politicians and possibly even to some of our sports persons. I'll leave it at that. We've gone through this wonderful journey over the last 70 years, much that we can celebrate, much that we have to introspect. Dr. Ramachandra Guha, privilege having you talking about India after Gandhi.
Thank you.
That's it on this very special India Today show. Thanks for watching. Jai Hind.